Who says stones are lifeless? All around us on natural rock surfaces, as well as buildings and monuments, stones are quietly alive, inhabited by lichens. Over time, as lichens grow, the stone itself becomes part of the lichen, contributing to the life of the site. We rarely notice it, and you might not have even thought about it, but it's happening all around us, pushing us to rethink the boundary between what is living, biotic, and what is not, abiotic. And that's where geographers come in. They can help us make sense of the relationships between people, places, and the environment. So, to explore these hidden connections, I am joined by Dr. Nicholas Carter, a biogeomorphologist and a lecturer and subject lead in geography at Christ Church College, University of Oxford. So, welcome, Nick, to the Curious Geographer. First of all, you describe yourself as a biogeomorphologist. What exactly is that?
Hi, Ellie. Thank you for having me. Well, first of all, it's a mouthful. So what I'm going to do is try and break it down a little bit and go back to say that first and foremost, I am a geographer. And many of your viewers and listeners will know that geography is split up into different areas, key areas. So we have kind of physical geography, we have human geography. And what you find is when you go to university, you find this kind of third field, which kind of meshes the two, called environmental geography. Um, but the field of biogeomorphology sits within a field called geomorphology, which is part of physical geography. So geomorphology is really kind of looking at the formation of the Earth's surface. And we kind of believe that its origins kind of go back possibly to ancient Greece, in fact, and kind of looking at the relative levels of land and sea. And Aristotle was very interested in this. Kind of look at how sediment flows from one to the other, kind of how things change. And as a kind of discipline, it was kind of solidified probably in around about 1830 when a very famous scientist called Charles Lyell, who was a geologist, wrote a book called Principles of Geology. And in that book, kind of, he really kind of brought together all the kind of current ideas about how the Earth's surface was formed. So biogeomorphology is a subdiscipline of geomorphology. And really what it does is it deals with the interactions between living things or organisms and the landscape. And this is a kind of two-way process. So the landscape influences what you find there, what lives there, what organisms inhabited, and what they do and what happens to them. But at the same time, living things and the biotic element, the biology, also influences how the land changes over time and how it looks over time. And we kind of think that maybe some of the earliest works of biogeomorphology were actually written by Charles Darwin. And in around about 1881, Darwin wrote a book about earthworms. And in that book, he looked at how earthworms were kind of influencing the land, the landscape and landforms, how the land looked. But I'd probably go back even earlier and look at in 1839, that Darwin published a book called The Voyage of the Beagle. And even in there, he was starting to talk about how living things were influencing the landscape or certain landforms. So I'll get onto that a little bit more later in our talk. So that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of what biogeomorphology is. So as a biogeomorphologist, my current interest in that field is actually looking at lichens and how lichens interact with stone, rocks, the natural landscape, but also kind of how they interact with our cultural heritage and historic monuments and that sort of thing.
Fantastic. I love that. And I love that you talked about the kind of sub-discipline of geography because when students are in school they study very much like human geography and physical geography and they do see the links, but you don't get until you get to university to see all the intricate parts of geography that also link to the wider subject. So linking to that, we're exploring something which students might not have heard much about at school. And today we're talking about lichens. So for those who have never heard much about them, what exactly are lichens and why are they so fascinating?
Well, Ellie, okay, well, I thought it'd be a good idea to start off by actually looking at some. So the first thing I'm going to show you is a branch, a branch that had fallen off a tree in Somerset. I picked it off the ground. And what you got here, you can see lots of kind of green things growing on it. Well, these are lichens. These are known as epiphytic lichens or fruticose lichens. And this particular species is known as Ramalina. And so you can see them all over that branch there. So you may have seen those out and about, if you've kind of been wandering through a woodland or something like that. The particular lichens I'm interested in are known as saxaculous lichens, or stone lichens. And so what I've got here is a big kind of chunk of limestone. And this has actually been given to me by Blenheim Palace, because it used to be on their roof. And they've given my research group this to have a look at. Now, you kind of look at that, you think it kind of looks kind of like just quite decayed and weathered. But what you might not realize is that the surface of this is very much alive and living. So you've got a number of lichens on here. So you've got some dart lichens here, and these are kind of verrucarias of what they're called, and they're epiphytic lichens. They sit on the surface of the stone. But you've also got some other lichens, which are interesting too, and they're kind of the lighter lichens you can see here, and they're called endolithic lichens. They're also verrucarias, but they submerge themselves in the stones. They tend to be less clear. They kind of tend to be just below the surface. So that's kind of what lichens can actually look like. And you'd be forgiven for not always seeing them if you're kind of looking at a stone building, because you can easily mistake them for decay or something else. Now, in terms of what a lichen is, now the kind of debate about what lichens are has been going on for a very long time, probably since 1860, in fact. And we've kind of settled on this idea that lichens are a kind of something called a symbiosis or a symbiotic association. And that's an association or a relationship between a fungus, which is called the mycobiont, and also an alga, usually, or a cyanobacteria, which is called the photobiont. And that's the bit that photosynthesizes. Okay. And those parts come together to form this body of the lichen. Now, the mycobiont forms the kind of shelter. And with those kind of epilithic lichens you see on this stone, the dark one there, for example, that's the bit you can see is the fungus, the mycobiont. And then within that, you've got the algae and the hyphae below. Okay, so which are in there, which is the kind of photosynthesizing element of it too. So that's kind of what a kind of lichen has been kind of traditionally sort of seen as, if you like. But the problem with lichens is that, and this is probably the first thing that's really fascinating about them, is they're really highly unusual in the sense that they don't fit what we call our Linnaeus system of classification. So biologists like to kind of order species using the Linnaeus system. If you imagine Darwin's tree of life, and at the end of each branch, you've got a species, okay, just there, species there. Well, lichens, they don't fit this, because what lichens do, rather than being at the tip of each branch, they kind of cover several of them. They kind of like lean over it, give you the side eye, as if to say, we don't fit, what are you going to do about it? And so that's kind of what lichens do, is they really challenge us in that regard. So because they don't fit our Linnaeus system, our classification system, what we do is we name them after the fungus. Now, for some scientists, this is absolutely fine and completely okay. But for other thinkers, it's not really okay. And so other scientists have been trying to think of other ways of thinking about lichens. And quite recently, things have got quite interesting, because it's been suggested that lichens are, in fact, complex ecosystems instead. So that are coming together of different organisms. But the problem with that for some biologists is that would mean that incorporates the substrate. So for something like a stone lichen is made up of its biology, but also the mineral element as well. Okay. And your listeners might start to think, right, so you've got a living thing which incorporates something that's not living, okay, or something we don't see as being living. And so this is kind of the debate that's kind of playing out, and why it's kind of controversial. Now, as a geographer, I love this idea of lichens being complex ecosystems and incorporating kind of more than the biology, because that kind of makes sense to me, because I think about the lichens that I've looked at and over time. And say, for example, those lichens which you find on stone surfaces for incredibly long periods of time. Lichens in the natural environment will be on stone surfaces for decades, hundreds of years, quite often thousands of years. We found lichens in northern Alaska, which have been on boulders for probably between 10 and 11,500 years. That's the entire interglacial period. Okay, so these things are in situ on stones and boulders, rock, for a very long period of time. So you can start to see, when you escape this kind of species scale of thinking, as a geographer, we deal with scale a lot. We think about scale. When you start to escape that species scale with lichens and start to incorporate that substrate too, the boundary gets blurred between the living and what we would call the non-living. And so it kind of comes together, and it's like becomes a continuum, which I think is something really, really fascinating. But there's lots of other fascinating things about lichens too. They're extremely ubiquitous, and what I mean by that is that you'll find them everywhere. They're on kind of all major kind of land surfaces that you can think of. They're in very cold environments. I've talked about northern Alaska. They're in very hot and dry environments. The deserts, for example, desert regions. You find them there. You find them in valleys. You find them at the tops of mountains. Okay. You find them in cities. You find them in rural areas. They're everywhere. So because of that, they're really very important in terms of geography. They're very important in terms of geomorphology, because they're going to be a biotic agent in the landscape in lots of different places over long periods of time as well, when you start to think of their potential longevity, etc. So that's something really interesting about them. But also they're sort of challenging the way we see the natural world. Their kind of resilience and their resistance, and kind of the periods of time we're talking about, our understanding of kind of how long something lives or should live, and the relationship between that and something that doesn't live or is non-living. With lichens, these things start to kind of become similar. And so, that's a really interesting aspect too. And finally, to hear just another really interesting aspect about lichens is they're very much part of our cultural heritage, not just kind of in the UK, for example, but globally. So, we've seen kind of lichens are very much kind of part of our folklore. Some of your listeners may not know this, but kind of in folklore, if you found a lichen in the skull of an escaped convict, this used to be a cure for epilepsy. And Usnea, kind of particular like, used to be hung above doors to keep away evil spirits, and also kind of sprites, various things, dangerous elves, all that sort of stuff. So very much part of our folklore. And lichens, kind of in the past, been kind of very much part of medicine. We've seen that around about 50% of lichens kind of have medicinal properties or antibiotic properties. And also kind of in the dyeing industry, dyeing of clothes, lichens have been a huge part of that throughout the world. So there's a really good story about some Roman con artists. What they used to do is that they used to dye togas with a specific type of lichen. And this was really quite bad, because this specific lichen was easily found, very, very cheap. And usually the togas were dyed with a very expensive shellfish. So what they were doing is, this was kind of like some sort of kind of con artistry. It was kind of eco-con artistry, if you like. But so you can see kind of even in Roman times, lichens were kind of being used for this. And then also kind of finally, we can go back to ancient Egyptian times, and lichens were kind of used in embalming. Again, because of the antibiotic qualities, they kind of, they sterilize things within the process. And so we can see that, that lichens are fascinating for a whole host of reasons, not just to do with the natural environment or the landscape, but also kind of cultural heritage as well.
Yeah. Fantastic. And we're going to talk a bit about cultural heritage in our last question as well. And I think what you were talking about, actually, a lot of students initially first understand ecosystems when they're studying it at GCSE, or even before, but really thinking about the relationships between biotic and abiotic. And it takes a while sometimes for students even to think, like, what are the abiotic features of ecosystems, and actually getting them to think, oh, rocks, water, air, and how biotic features rely on them and all the interdependence. But I really like what you were saying, that with lichens, they're abiotic and biotic almost like become one, particularly when you're thinking about these long lifetime kind of scales of how long they're around and how they actually interact. And it seems like there's so much that you've discussed in terms of timescales and different locations. But from your actual research, what have you discovered about lichens, stones, and the wider environment?
Yeah, well, the thing about lichens in geography, and in physical geography especially, is that traditionally they've been seen as being deteriorative to the environment they're in. So they're seen as kind of being agents of biological weathering, chemical weathering, even kind of physical action on the surface of stones and rocks. So the prevalent kind of attitude towards lichens is that they're deteriorative. Now, what my research is focused on is how they can be actually protective to the surfaces that they're on. So what I was kind of became fascinated by was that kind of how that sort of narrative was very subdued, and not just in my field of research, but also when it came to kind of cultural heritage conservation and kind of speaking to practitioners who work with historic buildings. And so, when we think about this kind of more protective aspect, what I discovered in my reading was that it had been mentioned before, and actually Darwin talked about it during the voyage of the Beagle. He was at a place called Pernambuco Harbour, which is on the southeast coast of Brazil. And he looked at the harbour wall, this kind of sandstone harbour wall, and he saw these kind of living things growing on it, barnacles. He called various things he called serpulae, things like that. And he saw them kind of all living there. And he thought that actually probably what a lot of those things are doing is they're protecting that sandstone harbour wall from the wave action, from change. And it was really an observation that kind of noted bioprotection, essentially. However, this wasn't actually kind of referred to or discussed or thought about for a very, very long time. And there was also a geologist called Archibald Geikie who published a book in around about 1903, a textbook of geology, who actually mentioned about lichens and a crust of lichens perhaps protecting the surface of stone and rock or wherever they are. But again, this has been ignored. It was ignored for a very, very long time until recent. And I started to do some research on it, looking and doing some experiments. And what I found to be the case is that the right is that actually lichens can be protective as well as deteriorative. In fact, it depends on a number of things, but they're not just all wholly deteriorative in the natural environment or on historic buildings. They're not. That's not how it works. So it depends on timescale, it depends on cover and kind of what species you've got. Yeah, essentially, this kind of complexity is really how it is. It's kind of like, you have some species which are deteriorative, some species which are actually protective. And that translates not only in the natural environment or the landscape, but into kind of the built and conserved environment as well. So kind of my research has very much been based on that and looking at this kind of process, this little known Earth surface process, really, of bioprotection.
Fantastic. And you mentioned heritage sites, and at the beginning you showed us a rock from Blenheim Palace as well. So we've talked about kind of why looking at lichens is fascinating, and you've kind of just opened up so many doors in terms of different things that lichen link to as well, in terms of where students can connect different ideas to. But what can it tell us about how we really value landscapes and heritage sites? What can it tell us about kind of our everyday interactions with these heritage sites or cultural places as well?
I think in terms of why this is important, Ellie, I think what I might do is give you some solid examples. And so, first of all, if I talk about Blenheim Palace, where I've been doing some research on the lichens, that really has been all about seeing stone differently. And so kind of looking at stone in a way I've talked to you about. So kind of thinking about stone as this kind of something which is not just inanimate, something which isn't just the abiotic, if you like. Now, cultural heritage environments are interesting because in cultural heritage environments, the kind of stone takes precedent over what's growing on it. So in those environments, kind of the abiotic or the stone itself is valued in a way quite often more so than what's growing on the stone. And so what can happen in historic environments and historic cultural environments and the built environment is that the biology can be under threat. So quite often a lot of stone cleaning takes place, and sometimes that's using kind of biocides. And this is going to all be very expensive as well, because the idea being that, kind of what needs to be there is a pristine stone without anything kind of growing on it, or it not looking like this, essentially. But, that's a question we really need to ask ourselves, because what should the stone look like? What should a ruin look like? What should a historic building look like? Now, I would argue very strongly that it should look natural. It should kind of also incorporate the ecology and the biology, and there's some good reasons for that. So, by valuing the ecology also, and kind of like seeing the ecology, the lichens, the mosses as part of the stonework, this has a number of benefits. And this is kind of something I've talked through with Blenheim. First of all, Blenheim is a World Heritage Site. And part of that, it has to enhance the ecological value of the site. Now, what lichens are doing on that stone surface, on those walls and on the buildings, they're doing exactly that. They're kind of adding to the ecological story of the site, the biodiversity of the site. I surveyed probably between 50 to 60 species in a survey I did there, which is very good, which is a very healthy kind of wall. Now, what's interesting about that is that, lichens photosynthesize. So what does that mean? Taking carbon dioxide, give out oxygen. So for any kind of historic environment, kind of cultural environmental place that has kind of aspirations of net zero, etc., and that sort of thing, this is good news. Lichens are kind of contributing to that kind of aim, but also kind of their lichens are really important in terms of the wider kind of natural environment as well. They're kind of tiny bugs which kind of live in lichens. There are things which kind of feed on lichens too. So there are benefits there. Kind of the ecological story becomes really important. And I've talked to you about how as well, there are lichens and many lichens which act bioprotectively over time. And so they are kind of nature-based solutions really to the problem of stone decay. They prevent other weathering agents from acting. They slow them down as well. So the action of the rain, the wind, those kind of like physical and kind of chemical weathering actions that can take place due to water or kind of like, heating and drying and hot and cold. Lichens can moderate that. They can also protect the surface from these things. They're kind of what we would call a nature-based solution too. So the research is important in the sense that it's kind of cultural places of cultural heritage. Lichens are a win-win. They're kind of adding to the kind of ecological story of the site and the vision of the site, but they're also kind of a nature-based solution too. And the last thing to say here, something I've been discussing with Blenheim Palace, is that for kind of a historic centre like Blenheim's very interested in cultural heritage, very interested in historic heritage, and lichens have this kind of cultural history. Which very much is another kind of history that kind of, or another layer of history, which contributes to Blenheim's story, that kind of ecological history, if you like, that adds to the story. And so I've talked to them about the folklore of lichens. I've talked to them about kind of all the things we've discussed in this session. So you can really start to see that, for a heritage site like Blenheim, they become really very important. But there's probably something else to say about this research too. And that's about valuing both the kind of biotic and abiotic components. And we're going to use these terms, valuing both those components in a natural landscape or in a heritage landscape. And the example I would give is about a year or so ago, I don't know if you remember this, but Just Stop Oil sprayed Stonehenge with an orange paint. Okay, and there was great concern at the time about the lichens, this kind of rare community of lichens that are growing on the stone. And what I found fascinating about that was a couple of things. First of all, no one ever really talks about lichens, but suddenly they were talking about lichens, which was very interesting. And it seemed to me what was coming out of this, but the lichens seemed to be more important than the stone itself. And so it's kind of almost the reverse of what I was talking about with kind of these heritage buildings, with the stone being more important, what's growing there. This time the kind of lichens were than the stone itself. But the kind of point here is that what we need to do is kind of value both. It's about valuing the lichens and the stone, the biotic and the abiotic, and actually seeing these interconnections, this kind of bridging that takes place, between the two. And if we start to kind of, we deal with Stonehenge, we start to kind of follow these arguments about kind of stone becoming part of a lichen, and so lichen incorporating stone, then you might say that actually lichens are part of the stone too. How do you differentiate this thing? And so what you start to do is make connections rather than kind of separating things out, which we tend to do as scientists and thinkers, is bringing things together. And really, kind of as geographers, this is kind of what we're trained to do, as well as make these connections, bring things together. Sometimes we have to escape scales to be able to do that, the species scale, for example, in this situation. But you start to see how the message becomes really important. And kind of, we're going through an environmental crisis at the moment. And our connections, the connections between humans and the natural environment are really strained. And so we've got to find ways of making good connections and having positive, strong relationships with the various components and not valuing one bit over another, not valuing those kind of very prominent, famous kind of organisms and species that we all know over kind of soil or over stone. We really do need to value and form relationships with all these elements of the natural world, so not just the biotic elements, but also what we would call the abiotic elements. So really kind of, I think this kind of research really does feed into that message and those connections, which are so important to us right now.
Fantastic. I have a quick question as well, just to add in, because you talked about researching and you talked about how many species you saw on Blenheim Palace as well. When you're researching as a geographer, lichens, um, is it best to keep everything in place there? Can you take it away, or is that destroying the environment? Because as you said, some of them have been, some lichens you found have been around thousands and thousands of years. How does actual geographical research, how is it undertaken in these sites?
It's a very good point, Ellie, and something as a geographer and as a lichenologist, I'm very mindful of. And so, um, obviously, what you're avoiding is destructive techniques. So it's actually kind of physically removing things or damaging the surface of something. Now, with something like this is actually came off the building; it had fallen away. So, and they couldn't fit it back in because they were actually restoring. So they actually gave this to my research group for us to have a look at and do some little bit of research on, actually. But you have to be very mindful. So whenever I'm surveying lichens, quite often what I'm doing is I'm just using a hand lens. Now I'm kind of at a point in my career now where I'm quite familiar with lichens and I kind of know what the different elements are and I can ID them fairly straightforwardly, especially limestone species, which is kind of my area of expertise. Very occasionally, you may have to take a small sample of a lichen and look at it under a microscope to be able to ID it properly. But again, you do that very kind of mindfully and also kind of in conversation with the custodians of the site of where you are, whether that's a natural environment or whether that's actually a historic building, for example, or the owner of a monument. So you have to be very cautious indeed, and that all, I mean, kind of what the priority is to conserve what's there, to be able to kind of act kind of ethically and appropriately in these situations. So yeah, it's a really important question. And in fact, in part of our research at Blenheim, we were very fortunate to discover a new species of lichen, Phaeospora parasitica, which is quite a rare lichen, not a new species, sorry, a very rare new species for Oxfordshire, very rare, very rare lichen in the UK. I think there's only around about 50 to 60 sites in the UK where you can find it, and that. Believe me, that's not very many because lichens are so ubiquitous, and so to actually find one, the first recorded species for Oxfordshire was absolutely great. So when you do that, you want to be absolutely sure that you're not damaging what's there, that you're, kind of, if you do have to sample like you're taking a minute amount and that will be generally okay for the lichen. It will survive that. I think I pointed out, lichens can be incredibly resilient and resistant to change.
That's fantastic. There is an interesting article, which is, if students are interested, I'll put a comment below, or a link to it. Can you tell us little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. I wrote an article for The Conversation, which is a journal, and your listeners, viewers can actually access that. They just Google my name, Nicholas Carter, and The Conversation and lichens, it will come up. And so and what's covered in that is very much what we've been talking about today, about kind of this relationship between lichens and stone, especially within a heritage context, and how kind of it's important to try and kind of see this kind of bigger picture, to try and kind of see stone differently. It's incorporating the biology as well, and potentially the kind of lichen incorporating the stone. So it talks about the benefits of that, kind of why that will help us in terms of conservation and making these connections with the natural landscape and the natural environment.
Absolutely fantastic. And that about concludes our conversation about lichens. Is there anything final that you would like to add for students?
Yes, sure. I mean, if you find yourself getting interested in lichens, what I would say is that if you visit the British Lichen Society website, it's a great website, lots of really helpful information and things that you can do as well, courses, etc. That's a great place to start. There's also a couple of books I'd like to recommend. There's Troy McMullen's book called The Secret World of Lichens, which is fantastic. It's got some really fun stuff in it, especially if you're a younger listener, because it's got kind of like some crazy lichens like fairy puke lichen, which is marvelous. And then there's a brilliant book, if you're slightly older, by a writer called Vincent Zonka, which is called Lichens. But it's not about the biology of lichens. It's about kind of poetry, the art, and also kind of how lichens are kind of metaphors in politics. It's incredible. It's a great work. It's a really interesting read, and will kind of open your mind to kind of the world of lichens and beyond. As a geographer, really, I think that's a fantastic book. And finally, I'm writing a book as well at the moment. I haven't got much more to say about it, apart from that it's to do with lichens are It's to do with seeing stone differently, and hopefully I'll have a bit more news about that at some point soon.
Yeah, fantastic. And we can put all of those in the comment box below for everyone to see. I just wanted to thank you so much. It's really interesting to really see what geographers in the field in terms of how research can impact our day-to-day interactions, particularly with things that we walk past lichens everywhere and might not even think about what they are and what the purpose is, and actually how we can, as I said, rethink how abiotic and biotic and different elements of ecosystems interact, but then how us as human beings are also interacting with those ecosystems as well, and the importance of something so small in our whole kind of world as well. So it's been a really fascinating talk, and yeah, let us know in the comments, everybody, what you think, and I'll put the links to all the articles below. That's it from us today.